The day my in-laws told me to get out, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain you see in movies, where lightning cracks and the sky turns purple. Just a gray, cold drizzle that soaked through my jacket while I stood on the porch of a house that had never really felt like mine. My mother-in-law held the door half open, her face completely still, and said, "You need to find somewhere else to go. This isn't your home anymore." She didn't ask where I would sleep that night. She didn't ask about the boxes I hadn't finished packing. She just waited until I picked up the single bag I'd grabbed in a panic. And then she closed the door. I stood there for a moment listening to the rain. My name is Claire. I was 28 years old, newly divorced, and standing in a driveway in Millfield, Ohio with $43 in my checking account and nowhere to go. I want to tell you this story because I spent a long time being ashamed of it. I thought it was a story about failure, about a marriage that fell apart, about a family that decided I wasn't worth keeping. But I understand now that it was never that story. It was always something else entirely. I just couldn't see it yet. Let me start at the beginning. I met Daniel when I was 23. I was working as a bookkeeper at a small accounting firm in Columbus, living in a studio apartment, eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week because I was trying to pay off my student loans ahead of schedule. I wasn't unhappy, I was just in motion. Heads down, moving forward, not looking up much. Daniel was charming in the way that certain people are charming before you understand what that actually means. He remembered small details. He showed up. He made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone was paying attention to me, specifically not just a version of me that was convenient for them. We got married after 2 years. The wedding was at his parents' house, a big colonial in Millfield, that his father had bought in the 90s when the town still had its paper mill running. His mother, Patricia, organized everything. She had opinions about the flowers, the seating chart, the color of the napkins. I told myself, that was just how she showed love. I moved into the colonial after the wedding because Daniel wanted to be close to his parents. His father, Gerald, had some health issues, and Daniel was the oldest son, and it just made sense, he said. It was only supposed to be for a year. It was 3 years. I want to be fair here. Not every day was bad. There were Sunday dinners that felt warm. There were moments when Patricia laughed at something I said, and I felt a small bloom of belonging. But underneath all of it was something I couldn't quite name, a constant, low-level pressure to be smaller, to want less, to need nothing. Patricia handled the household finances because, she explained, she always had. Even after Daniel and I got married, even after I pointed out that bookkeeping was literally my profession, she waved me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You shouldn't have to worry about all that," she said. I worried about all of that constantly, because I had no idea what was happening with our money. Daniel handled the joint account. I had my own account from my salary, but Daniel had asked me, early in the marriage, to put most of it into the joint account each month so we could build together. I did. I trusted him. That word now sits in my mouth, like something I need to spit out. The cracks started showing in year 2. Daniel would come home late and smell like a bar and give me explanations that didn't hold together when I thought about them later. I brought it up twice, and both times he turned it into a conversation about my insecurity, my inability to trust, how his mother had warned him I might be like this. That last part is the one that stayed with me. His mother had warned him. I started keeping notes. Not because I had a plan. I didn't have a plan. I kept notes because I needed something solid to hold on to, something that couldn't be rearranged by a smooth explanation or a long hug. I wrote down dates and times and things that didn't add up. I kept the notebook in my work bag, which no one ever touched. In March of year 3, I found the credit card statements. Patricia had left them on the kitchen table by accident, or maybe not by accident, I still don't know. There were 3 cards in Daniel's name that I had never seen before. The balances together totaled just under $60,000. The charges went back 18 months. Hotels in Cincinnati. Restaurants I'd never been to. A jeweler in Cleveland that I knew we'd never visited together. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Then I took photographs of every page with my phone, put the statements back exactly where they were, picked up my work bag, and drove to my office. I sat in the parking lot and called my sister-in-law. Not Daniel's sister. My sister-in-law. From my side, my brother Marcus's wife, Diane. Diane answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring. I told her what I'd found. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I just recited the numbers, the way I would recite numbers at work. Flat. Precise. When I finished, Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come here tonight. Don't say anything to him yet. Just come here." I said, "I don't want to put you and Marcus out." She said, "Claire, come here tonight." Diane was 34 at the time, a physical therapist with a voice that could make you feel simultaneously comforted and like you had no reasonable argument left. She and Marcus had a small house in Glendale, about 40 minutes from Millfield. 2 bedrooms. A backyard with a vegetable garden that Diane tended obsessively from April through October. I drove there after work with my work bag, my laptop, and a change of clothes I kept in the car for gym days that I never actually went to the gym for. Marcus opened the door before I even knocked. He looked at my face and didn't say anything. He just stepped back to let me in, and Diane came out of the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel, and that was it. That was the whole arrival. No drama, no questions right away. Just the door opening and the kitchen smelling like something with garlic. We ate dinner, and I told them everything. Not just the credit cards, everything. The 3 years of quiet pressure. The explanations that didn't hold. The joint account I'd been pouring my salary into for 2 years. When I added up my contributions out loud for the first time, I stopped talking mid-sentence because the number surprised even me. Marcus put down his fork. Diane said, "You need a lawyer. Tomorrow." I said I couldn't afford a lawyer. Diane said, "You let me worry about that. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something about Diane, because it matters." Diane grew up in a family where money was used as a weapon. Her own father had done something similar to her mother, not the same details, but the same shape. The financial control, the isolation, the slow narrowing of a person's world, until they couldn't imagine existing outside of it. Diane had watched her mother spend 11 years rebuilding from that. She recognized the architecture of what had happened to me before I fully recognized it myself. She didn't tell me any of this that night. She just made up the guest room and left a clean towel on the bed and said, "You don't have to figure out everything tonight." I lay in their guest room and stared at the ceiling and thought, I have $43. I have a work bag. I have notes in a notebook. And I thought, that might be enough. It wasn't enough right away. Nothing is ever enough right away. The next 3 months were the kind of ugly that people don't usually include in the version of the story they tell later. The lawyer Diane found a woman named Patricia, which I found grimly funny, reviewed everything I'd documented, and told me the situation was complicated but not hopeless. Daniel had been moving money in ways that were difficult to trace but not impossible. My documented contributions to the joint account worked in my favor. The credit card debt, incurred without my knowledge or consent, would be examined carefully. I filed for divorce in April. The day Daniel was served, he called me 14 times. I watched my phone light up from Diane's kitchen table, while Diane sat across from me doing a crossword puzzle, occasionally glancing up to make sure I was still breathing. The in-law situation resolved itself in the way I already described, Patricia telling me to collect my things, the rain, the door closing. By that point, I had already moved most of what mattered to Diane and Marcus's house, a box at a time, over several weeks. Patricia didn't know that. She thought she was delivering a blow. What she actually delivered was a formality. I moved into the guest room with my boxes and my notebook, and my $43, which had since grown to about $400, because I'd stopped contributing to the joint account the day after I found the guest. Statements. Marcus never complained. Not once. He was quiet about it, in the way that certain people are quiet, not cold, just steady. He'd come home from work, and there would be my shoes by the door, and my mug on the drying rack, and he'd just add them to the landscape of the house without comment. He gave up his home office so I could have a door to close, when I needed to be alone. He set up a folding table and worked from the living room for 7 months. 7 months. I kept track because I felt the weight of it. Every week I did a mental accounting. How long I'd been there, what I'd taken, what I still owed. Diane told me to stop doing that. She said, "You are not a debt." I appreciated it, and I didn't stop doing it. The divorce took 8 months from filing to final. 8 months of hearings and documents, and a deposition where I sat across a conference table from Daniel, and he looked at me like I was someone he'd only met briefly and hadn't thought about since. The financial forensics took the longest. Daniel's attorney tried several different framings. None of them held up. The settlement was finalized on a Wednesday in December. I remember it was cold and clear, that particular winter blue sky that Ohio gets when the temperature drops below 20. My attorney called me at 11 in the morning and read me the terms. The court awarded me reimbursement for my documented contributions to the joint account, plus interest, plus a portion of the marital assets that had been shielded. The total was $78,400. I wrote the number on a piece of paper and looked at it. Then I went home to Diane and Marcus's home. Still, and I made dinner. Pasta with the good tomatoes from Diane's garden that she'd jarred in September. I set the table and put out the nice plates without asking, which was something I'd been too hesitant to do for months, afraid of overstepping, afraid of taking up too much space. When they came home, Diane saw the table and looked at my face, and she knew before I said anything. Marcus sat down, and I told them the number, and he nodded once, slowly, the way he does when he's processing something that he doesn't want to react to too fast. Diane said, "Good. Just that. Good." Then she sat down and asked if I'd put enough salt in the pasta water. I'd been living with them for 10 months by that point. Marcus had his folding table in the living room. I'd been paying them rent for the last 4 of those months. Not enough. Never enough, and helping with the grocery runs and the yard work and anything else I could find to make myself useful. It still felt inadequate. When you calculate what someone has given you in terms of steadiness and presence and grace, there is no accounting system that handles that currency. The money came through in January. I spent 2 weeks doing what I'd been doing for 8 months, which was researching apartments, neighborhoods. What a reasonable first month's deposit looked like in Columbus versus what the market had done since I'd last rented anything. I found a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood called Clintonville. Ground floor, small yard, good light. I toured it on a Thursday and put down the deposit on Friday. That night I told Diane and Marcus I'd found a place. Marcus looked up from his book and said, "Yeah?" I said yes, and told them about the apartment, and told them the move-in date, and said I wanted to have them over for dinner once I had the kitchen sorted. I was trying to be calm and practical about it. Diane looked at me for a moment, and then said, "You know you didn't have to rush." I said I wasn't rushing. She said, "I know. But you know." I knew. I moved in on a Saturday in February. Marcus rented a truck and drove it, even though I told him I could hire movers. He showed up at 8 in the morning with coffee and spent 4 hours moving boxes without mentioning his bad knee once, which Diane had warned me he would do and had preemptively taped up the night before against his objections. By 2 in the afternoon, the boxes were in. The furniture, what I'd bought slowly over the previous 6 weeks. Nothing extravagant, just the things a person needs, was roughly in place. Marcus put together the bed frame, which had 11 steps in the instructions, and he completed in 7 because he skipped the ones he found self-evident. Diane arranged the kitchen while I wasn't looking, because she knew if I was standing there I would second-guess every decision. At 3, we ordered sandwiches, and sat on the floor of the living room, because I only had 1 chair, and ate, and it was quiet in the good way. When they left, I walked them out to the truck. Marcus hugged me. He's not a frequent hugger, which makes it mean more when he does, and got in the driver's side. Diane hugged me too, and held on for a moment longer, and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the truck turn the corner. Then I went back inside, into my apartment, and sat down on the floor in the empty living room, and it was quiet, and it was mine. That's not the end of the story. I want to be clear about that. Because if it ended there, it would still be a good story. Woman loses everything. Sister-in-law opens a door. Woman rebuilds. That's real, and that's enough. But there's one more part, and it happened 11 months later, and I almost didn't open the door when it came. It was January again. I'd been in the apartment almost a year. I had a proper couch by then, and a bookshelf I'd assembled correctly on the first try, and a kitchen that Diane had started calling actually well organized, which from her is basically a standing ovation. I was home on a Saturday afternoon, not doing anything particular, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Ohio area code. I almost didn't answer it. When I did, there was a pause, and then a voice I recognized immediately but hadn't heard in over a year. It was Gerald, Daniel's father. I almost hung up. My hand actually moved toward ending the call before I stopped myself. I said, "Gerald." He said, "Claire." Yes. "I know you have no reason to talk to me. I want to ask for 5 minutes. Just 5. I said nothing for a moment. Gerald had always been quieter than his wife, a man who seemed to exist slightly at the edges of his own family. I had never been close to him. I had never been sure there was an opening for closeness. I said, 5 minutes. He said, "Patricia doesn't know I'm calling. I need you to understand that first." I understood that first. Gerald told me, in a voice that sounded like a man choosing each word from a limited and carefully reviewed supply, that he had been diagnosed 9 months earlier with a condition that required him to get his affairs in order. Not imminently, he was careful to say, but seriously enough that he was doing a thorough accounting of things, decisions he'd made, things he'd let happen. He said, "I knew something was wrong. In that marriage. I knew before it ended. I told myself it wasn't my place." I said, "Okay." He said, "It was my place. I was wrong not to say something." The silence between us was long enough that I walked from the living room into the kitchen and back without realizing I'd done it. Then he said there was something else. He said that in the process of getting his affairs in order, he had reviewed the family's accounts. He had always kept his own records, separate from Patricia's, and he had found something that he thought I should know about. When Daniel and I were first married, Gerald said, he had quietly set aside an account. The intention had been a wedding gift money that would go to Daniel and me together to start our lives. It had been in Gerald's name while he waited for the right moment to transfer it. He had never transferred it. The marriage had fallen apart before he found the right moment, and then the right moment had passed, and he said this plainly, convinced himself that the money should stay in the family. He had convinced himself wrong, he said. He knew that now. The account had grown over 4 years. The current amount was $31,200. He said, "I want to transfer it to you, not to Daniel. To you. I've spoken to my attorney. It was always intended for you both, and you're the one who had nothing when you left." I sat down on my couch. I said, "Gerald." He said, "You don't have to thank me. I should have done more. I should have done it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." I thought about what to say for a long time. I thought about the rain on that driveway. I thought about Diane's kitchen table, and Marcus's folding table in the living room, and the $43 and the notebook full of dates and numbers. I said, "I appreciate you calling." He said, "There's one more thing." He said that he had told Patricia what he was doing. Not asked, told. And that when Patricia had heard the number and understood what it meant, she had gone very quiet. Gerald said he hadn't seen her quiet like that in a long time. She had sat at the kitchen table where I'd found the credit card statements, and after a while she had said, in a voice he'd had trouble hearing, I didn't ask where she was going to go. She hadn't asked me where I was going to go. Gerald said Patricia wanted to call me herself. He said he'd told her that was her choice to make, and mine, to accept or not. I said, "I'll think about it." He said, "That's fair." The money transferred 2 weeks later. I did not use it to move somewhere bigger. My apartment was right. I did not use it all at once. I put most of it into a savings account and paid off the remainder of my own student loans with a portion, and with another portion, I did one thing that I hadn't let myself do in a long time. I enrolled in the CPA exam prep course I'd been looking at for 3 years and never signed up for because there was always something that felt more urgent. Patricia did call. About 3 weeks after Gerald's call. I let it go to voicemail the first time. Then I listened to the voicemail, which was 2 minutes long, and mostly silence, interrupted by her saying my name, and then stopping, and then saying she wasn't sure what to say, and she'd been told she should say something, and she was sorry for that answer, but it was an honest one. I called her back the next day. I won't tell you we repaired everything. I won't tell you the call was warm, or that it ended with plans to have coffee. It was two women on the phone, who had both been, in different ways, shaped by the same man's absence of spine, and who were figuring out in real time what the other one owed them, and what they owed in return. At the end of the call, Patricia said, "You deserved better from us." I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't know if there's a way back from that." I said, "I don't know either." That was honest, and it was what I had. Last April, Diane and Marcus drove to my apartment for dinner. The first dinner I'd hosted since moving in, really hosted. Not just ordered food and sat on the floor. I made the good pasta again, with the jarred tomatoes from Diane's garden, and I set the table with the plates I'd finally bought, the ones I'd picked out myself without anyone's input, blue and white, impractical for everyday use, and exactly right for this. We ate and talked about ordinary things. Diane's patients, Marcus's project at work, the vegetable garden, and what she was putting in this year. Nobody mentioned Daniel. Nobody mentioned the guest room, or the folding table, or the $43. At the end of the night, when they were putting on their coats in the hallway, Marcus looked around the apartment, the bookshelf, the couch, the kitchen Diane had approved, and he said, "You did good with this place." He meant the apartment. He also meant everything else. I said, "I had good help." He nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when I told him the settlement number, like he was receiving information he'd already known was true. They left and I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment in the quiet. My apartment, my plates, my kitchen, with enough salt in the pasta water. My life, put back together in a shape that fit me, not the shape someone else had decided on, not the shape I'd shrunk myself into for 3 years. This one, built from the bottom, from a work bag, and a notebook, and a door that opened when I needed it to. Not the life I thought I'd have. Better. In the ways that actually matter. And I thought, standing in that hallway, this is enough. This is exactly enough.